In this episode, let's work on the smoke from the Rolling Stones. I didn't make it directly on the volcano, but instead I made the smoke first and placed it on the mountain later. Actually, when we work on the midground and the background, it's a more efficient and convenient way to either place it or modify it. Well, before starting, we need to think about how and where the smoke is generated and how to create a source in order to achieve better efficiency. The smoke is generated from the Rolling Stones, so I created a grid and obtained its interactions with the stones as the source. Okay, let's dive into the project. These nodes are to simulate the animation of the stones. These are to set the source. Then the collision simulation, the solver. Alright, let's get into it. First of all, I made 3 different sources to avoid the simulations being similar. Then fractured the source, scattered 500 points, packed the pieces, gave it the velocity attribute. I added a noise here. Then the RBD solution to simulate the animation of rolling stones. Get into top. Here is a ground as the collision object. I moved it down 50 meters. Imported the pieces. Remember to tick this checkbox so that the velocity attribute in sub can work. To avoid the stones jumping, I set their bounce to 0. I also set the bounce of the ground to 0. Besides, I increased the gravity. The sub-solver 1 is to delete the low-speed stones. Let's take a look. I applied length to velocity and deleted the stones whose speed is smaller than 5. Activate the attribute transfer node. Here I obtained the interactions of the ground with the stones as the source. If we don't remove the low-speed stones, the simulation will be incorrect. Disable the sub-solver for now. The source will emit smoke continuously even when the stones stop moving. Obviously, the simulation will go wrong. In fact, when stones stop moving or move at a very low speed, the smoke will disappear gradually. So I choose to delete the low-speed stones. Thus, no smoke will be generated around them. So much for DOP. Export the pieces. Unpack them. Here I made a ground. These nodes are to gain the bounding box of all the stones. Merged the first frame and the last frame. Got the bounding box. Kept the bottom primitive. Subdivided it. And colored it. Then I applied the solver node to gain the interactions of the ground with the stones, so that they can disappear gradually. If we use the attribute transfer node, when the pieces are deleted, their source will also disappear immediately, which is very stiff. In fact, the smoke stops gradually in the real world rather than immediately. Yet when we use solver, look at this stone. It has already disappeared. But its source has not. Instead, it disappears gradually. Such source animation is realistic. Get into the solver. I transferred the color attribute here. We can see it's transferred frame by frame. Meanwhile, multiplied it by 0.9 so that the color can disappear gradually. Next, transferred the velocity of the stones to the source. I made 3 flipbooks for comparison. To avoid the influence of other factors, I disabled all the parameters under the Shape tab. The source in this flipbook is with the velocity attribute. We can see the smoke moves forward slightly. In this one, the velocity attribute is not transferred to the source. The smoke dynamics are not affected by the forward force, only drifting backward. In the third flipbook, I kept the default parameter. The velocity attribute is much stronger than the first one. The smoke is influenced too much, which is not realistic. So I adjusted the parameters here. Next, deleted the non-source part, scattered points. Remember to inherit the veil attribute and the color attribute. Here I defined the necessary attributes. Let's take a look. I multiplied the CD attribute by 2, then assigned the result to the density attribute. So the density will gradually disappear with the CD attribute. The CD attribute ranges from 0.9 to 0.01. I multiplied it by 2, 1.8. To enhance realism, I adjusted the density based on the speed to reduce the smoke when its speed is very low. Set the P scale to 5, converted the source to volume, including the velocity field and the density field. This node is to convert the stones to VDB. Then shrink the VDB somehow, since the VDB was so large that some smoke would be swallowed. I also made flipbooks. Let's take a look. In this flipbook, the stones are not shrunk. Some smoke is swallowed by them. In this one, the stones are shrunk. They differ a lot, especially at the beginning. Let's move on to the smoke solution. First of all, set the collision objects. One is the stone VDB. The other is the ground. Import the VDB here and here. This part is for the smoke solution. Let's check the SIMRAS, not high. Typed in density in source volume. I upped the scale since it's not enough. Keep the scale of the veil field and the temperature field. Let's take a look at the solver. I lowered down the cooling rate. If it's kept high, the temperature will be cooled down shortly, and the smoke will stop rising, which is not what I want. Let's see the flipbooks. In this flipbook, its cooling rate is 0.5. We can see the smoke moves pretty slow in the rear part. Some even become steel. Like here. In this flipbook, the cooling rate was adjusted much better. Alright, let's go on. The acceleration and direction were adjusted. Since we're making elements for the final scene, we need to consider if they can be well integrated into the whole scene. The slope of the mountain is like this. Thus, the smoke should rise in this way. So we adjust the gravity direction accordingly. Here I set a negative x-axis and a positive y-axis and set the acceleration to 50. Okay, let's jump to the Shape tab, the dissipation here. Let's check the flipbooks. In this flipbook, the dissipation is by default 0.5. The smoke dissipates pretty rapidly. This flipbook is with a dissipation of 0.005. I also modified the active region of the smoke. Directly added 2 at the end and added 30 here. Besides, added values on the positive and negative x-axes separately. The smoke actually drifts backward. that is mainly toward the negative x-axis. So I expanded the band more toward the negative x-axis and a bit toward the positive x-axis. Let's check out the cache. We can see there are some dents. This is the cache after we fix this issue. The next step is to add turbulence. First, I enabled the turbulence and keyframed it to weaken it gradually. Set the swirl size to 90. I didn't apply a control field here. Okay, let's check the swirl size with the box. I've made flipbooks for comparison. This is before keyframing the turbulence. We can see the smoke gets more and more chaotic, especially the front part. Compared with this flipbook, the surface is disturbed, yet it's too much. That's why I keyframed the turbulence. Quite different. After the turbulence, I worked on the disturbance, and I didn't keyframe it. Actually, I did it at first, but after comparison, I found the smoke looks better without keyframing the disturbance. Set a small sized noise, and controlled the disturbance with a speed field. Let's check out the cache. Compared with the previous one, rich details appear. Yet in some areas, like here and here, the details are not enough. So I applied the speed field to adjust it further. The ramp is the same with the one in DOP. Besides, for these areas, I raised the scale of the disturbance separately and kept the disturbance in other areas. Make a comparison. It looks better. Let's check the size of the disturbance with the box. Very small. Take a look at the value of the disturbance, 50. Let's check out the result. More details are added. Yet in some areas, they are not enough. Later, I controlled it with the speed field. A bit better, but still not enough. Like here. So I added a gas vortex confinement. Its ramp is the same as that of the disturbance. Do not forget to disconnect the wire here. After adding the gas vortex confinement, the details are perfect. Let's check the flipbook. Now there are plentiful details. Okay, let's take a look at the dynamics. I simulated 3 various shapes for later use. Their dynamics are different. Next, let's go through the creation process of these 2 sparse smokes. Before starting, let's first check where they will be placed. The thin smoke is generated from the plane burning, so I placed them here, here, and here. They are very large. One is 300 meters high, and the other is 1200 meters. For the smaller one, its dissipation is relatively faster. Yet the dissipation of the larger one is nearly unnoticeable. When rising up, it's disturbed and thus expands continuously, generating the final shape like this. We can see their edges are random and natural, rather than simply straight. Alright, let's go through the creation process. First of all, I created a circle. scattered some points on it, and set random p-scale for them. Then I instanced Circle 5 onto these points. Finally, I obtained this random source. It is made up of several scattered circles in different sizes, and the distance between them is random. This way, the smoke around the source can be random and natural. Let's take a look at the dynamics of the smoke. Around the source, there are many variations. If I applied a single circle as the source, the result would be different. Next, I scattered some points, added a noise node, and set its value on the y-axis to 0. It's fine to keep the edges noisy somehow. These nodes are mostly created by a shelf tool pyro configure billowing smoke. I set the mode of the pyro source to keep input to input these points. Then I created a density attribute. As for add noise 3, I just set its element size to 5 and kept the other parameters as they were. Let's create a 5-meter box and check how big it is. Looks good. Next, I'm going to show you how the noise affects the smoke. In this flowbook, the source without the noise is emitting smoke continuously. After I added the noise, the source is emitting smoke intermittently, thus generating more variance and bringing a lot of realism. Next, convert the points to volume source. Here, I brought up the particle scale because it's too small by default to emit enough smoke. These nodes are for creating a velocity field with the curl noise. Okay, let's see the comparison before and after adding it. In this flowbook without a velocity field, the smoke just goes straight out of the source, which thus looks kind of unnatural. After I added the velocity field to the source, the smoke looks more natural and realistic. Alright, let's go through how the velocity field is created. First of all, I applied the point jitter node to randomize the locations of these points. Then I added the point velocity node. I didn't alter the parameters in the basic tab, but only increased the swirl size in the curl noise tab. Display the noise. It's like this. As for the rest parameters in the point velocity node, I kept them as they were. Then I converted these points to a volume source. Maybe you wonder why I randomized the location of the points. Because it can expand the influence range of the velocity field. If I choose to bring up the p-scale to achieve the same result, the noise will be blurred somehow. However, with the point jitter node, we needn't worry about that. Okay, let's check the settings of the pyro solver. The voxel size was set to 0.9. I didn't set a high resolution since it's unnoticeable in the scene. Jumping to the sourcing tab. I have imported the density field and created the temperature field based on it. The velocity field was imported too. I maintained these parameters as they were. We are creating a 300-meter smoke. Without a large gravity acceleration, it's hard to achieve that height. In the pyro solver, I added a gas wind blowing along the negative x-axis. We can see the smoke is drifting toward this direction. Then I took down the cooling rate to 0.01, a very low value. Let's see the comparison before and after. In this flue boat with the default cooling rate, there is only a gas wind without any buoyancy. In fact, there is a positive correlation between the buoyancy and the temperature field. The lower the temperature, the weaker the buoyancy. With the default cooling rate, the temperature cools down slowly, so the buoyancy is very weak. That's why the smoke cannot rise up. Yet, if I set a very small cooling rate, the smoke can work well. Okay, let's move on to this turbines. I enabled it first. Still, we check it with a box, set its size to 1.5. The noise is very small. As for other parameters, I maintained them as they were. Alright, let's check the influence of the disturbance. There are many more details. But there comes another issue. There are less variations on the shape with the absence of some large turbulence. Yeah, I need not only the details but also the large turbulence. So I enabled the control field and adjusted the reamp, remapping the density from 0.0120 to the disturbance from 1 to 0.25. Let's check the smoke in this range. It's at the edge. Okay, we make a comparison before and after enabling the control field. The one without a control field and this one with it. We can see some large turbulence is kept within the controlled field. Compared with the one without disturbance, there are some details, but I think they are still insufficient. To enrich them, here I created a gas vortex confinement. Let's see the comparison. This is the one with the confinement and the one without it. With it, the details are richer. Actually, the current simRes is still a bit too low. If we bring it up, more details can be captured. Now the silhouette looks a bit too straight. With a large turbulence, the smoke looks better. Let's go through the parameters of the turbulence. Its size is 100 and its scale is 0.05. There is a 100-meter box for reference. Given the smoke is pretty large, the dissipation needs to be set to a very small value. So those clamp down. If we only lower down the dissipation but skip the clamp, the smoke will dissipate quickly. I simulated 1350 frames, since the speed of the smoke was too slow to reach the given height in a short time. Alright, so much for this 300-meter smoke. Let's move on to the 1200-meter smoke. After finishing the 300-meter one, I directly duplicated the process and adjusted some parameters. Then I obtained the 1200-meter smoke. Let's run through the process. The source here is the same as before. It's a cluster of some circles with gaps in between. The following process is also similar. Firstly, I added a noise node to let the source emit smoke intermittently. After that, I brought up the element size of this noise. The 300-meter smoke is smaller than this one, and its element size is also smaller. When we work on the larger one, a larger element size is needed. Then I converted the source to volume. I lowered down the simRes, otherwise it would take a pretty long simulation time to gain the final look. Jump into the sourcing tab. Here I just increased the scale somewhat to bring up the buoyancy. Besides, lifting the gravity acceleration will also do the job. I increased the timescale to 1.5. It can make the pyrosim appear sped up. Jump into the Shape tab. I lowered down the dissipation a bit more. also the clamp value. After all, this smoke is much higher than the previous one. Then the disturbance here. I increased it a bit. It won't be big enough if we keep the same values as the last smoke. For the rest parameters in the Shape tab, I didn't adjust them. Alright, get into the Parallel Solver. For the gas wind, I added the upward force. Let's make a comparison. This is the one with the upward force and the one without. Obviously, it became more vertical. I didn't add the buoyancy because the buoyancy is affected by the temperature field. For example, the temperature of this part is very low, so it's hard to raise up even if I lifted the buoyancy. Yet the wind is not limited by the temperature field. Then the gas vortex confinement node. I brought up the confinement scale. 0.75 was not large enough to generate rich details. As for the two gas turbulence nodes, their role is different from that of the smaller smoke. First, I created a 100-meter gas turbulence and set its scale to 1. It's medium-large. Let's take a look at its effect. The smoke after adding the gas turbulence and the one without adding it. We can see it just goes upward straightly. Yet this smoke is expanding during the process of rising up. Back to this one. There is a mushroom-shaped top, which is unnatural. But after I added the gas turbulence, that issue is settled. Get into the control settings. I set the control field to temperature. Let's take a look at its control range. Here it is. For this part, where the smoke is at a high temperature, I didn't make the gas turbulence work on it too much. I set the scale to 0.2. The part with low temperature is also affected by the same scale. This way, the outer part of the smoke wouldn't be broken a lot. On the contrary, if we didn't apply the control field, the whole smoke will be disturbed too much, which is unnatural. After applying the control field, the smoke is not so noisy overall. Instead, it has more details and looks natural. Then influence threshold here, I set it to 0. It's 0.01 by default. That means when the density is greater than 0.01, this gas turbulence can work. Let's see the smoke in this range. Duplicate the attribute volume node. We can see there are very few areas where the density is greater than 0.01. If we still maintain the default value, the gas turbulence will only affect this small part. Yet when we set the influence threshold to 0, the entire smoke will be affected. Alright, let's move on to gas turbulence 3. I set this parameter to 0 as well, and set its swirl size to 300. There is a 300-meter box for reference. Let's check how this gas turbulence works. Without this node, the smoke simply rises upward straightly, lacking some large variations. Yet with the gas turbulence, the stiff shape is broken and looks more natural. Then the control field here. Its settings are similar to the previous one, besides we need to set its two ends to 0. If we don't apply the control field, the smoke will be broken too much, not like smoke anymore. After the 1200th frame, the smoke reaches the desired height, so I took the scale down to 0.1. Thus, during the frame range 1300 to 1500, the smoke won't be disturbed too much. After simulation, I found it rises a bit too fast, so I applied a read time node. I selected the bivoxel position here and set the speed to 0.35. After testing, I found the simulation could still play smooth. Alright, we're done with this smoke too. See you soon.